Hey, 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 hey!
It's about to get crazy. It's about to go down. It's about to get crazy. It's gonna be loud. This is our house. We do what we wanna. We'll blow the roof up. Everybody's coming. It's about to get crazy. It's about to go down. It's about to go down.
You are listening to the Gritty Podcast, where we talk about all things gritty. Life is not easy. Life isn't fair. It never was, and it never will be. A good life takes grit, because the best things in life come from hard work, sacrifice, resolve, determination, and perseverance. Because grit means never quitting. It means coming back time and time again until you succeed. So on this show, we talk hunting, we talk outdoors, we talk conservation, we talk family and life. We talk fitness, and we talk strength, strength of body, strength of mind, and strength of character. Prioritize who you are and who you want to be. Get gritty, because life isn't fair, and a little grit can make all the difference. We did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills, and winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us, it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded with the blessings of the great mystery. Not until the hairy man from the east came, and with brutal frenzy heaped injustices upon us and the families we loved, was it wild for us. When the very animals of the forest began fleeing from his approach, then it was that for us the Wild West began. That's an excerpt from Luther Standing Bear. He wrote a number of books. He's a Native American Indian that was born in right around 1860. Today's podcast, I'm going to go over this book that he wrote. You know, in my life, I've had books and people that I've met that have influenced or informed my opinions and changed how I see the world, and sometimes caused a paradigm shift for me in how I see things, like a complete reversal or a complete like aha moment where I see things totally different than I used to. As my podcast co-host, invisible co-host, for those that are watching, my brother is here.
Hey, folks.
So I'm just going to dive right in. When I first read this book, I noticed a huge difference between the way maybe I saw the world. I was attending business school in college. I had some plans for building a home. I had all these ideas of my future and what it would look like, what I saw as enriching my life and adding value to it. I had these conceptions. And then when I read the book and I took in the Indian point of view, as he says in this book, and I'm going to use the word Indian because he uses it throughout the entire text. Native American is what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to be offensive to anyone either. He also says white man a lot, so all you white people don't get all upset about that. But I'm going to contrast his view of how he saw the wild and nature, and how the European view was. It's pretty stark in the book. It made me think completely differently about life and about the world around me. And the reason it came up is recently I was listening to Senator Mike Lee of Utah, Republican of Utah, talk about public lands and the transfer of federal to state. And it got me thinking about how I see the world and how I see nature and how I see conservation, what I think is important. It got me thinking about this book and how it influenced my thoughts and how I see the world. And I thought, I want to share this with all of you that listen to the podcast. And I hope that it if you don't already kind of have some of these ideas, I hope that as you listen to this, that it kind of opens up your eyes to some things. So what I want to do is I'll just dive right in. It says, so Luther Standing Bear wrote the book, and I want to tell you a little bit about him. He was born in 1860 roughly, somewhere in that time frame. Born and raised in a traditional Sioux manner. He has an explanatory note in the book where he says, Lakota is the tribal name of the western bands of Plains people, who now known as the Sioux. The eastern bands calling themselves Dakotas. The word Sioux is not an Indian, but a French word, and since the author is dealing with the tribal customs of his people, he chooses to use the ancient tribal name of the band to which he belongs, the Lakota. So there's also like the Oglala, which was like the band that Crazy Horse was part of. You have Sitting Bull. You have this generation at this time in 1860, and they are still living a traditional Indian, Native American lifestyle on the plains. And he's born, Luther Standing Bear is born right around this time. And in 1863, 64, 65, they had what they call the Powder River Campaign. And if any of you that have seen Dances with Wolves, you could be familiar with this, but it's about that same time frame, just to give you a feel of maybe what it was like if you've seen the film. The U.S. soldiers are kind of pressuring the Lakota to adopt reservation life. And so there's these little skirmishes and battles and stuff that are occurring between these people. Well, Luther Standing Bear is born right at the time of this, slightly before the Powder River Campaign. Maybe he's 5 years old during this time. Then the Powder River Campaign happens, and then in 1868, the Lakota agree that they're going to live on a reservation. And so the Sioux reservation is built, I think it's 25 million acres or something like that. And the Sioux the Sioux or the Lakota move on to that reservation. They live there for a while, but its reservation life is not very well suited to them. They were taking handouts from the government, like in forms of cattle and blankets and things like that. And those supplies were not doing well, and they left the reservation, many of them, and they were told they got to come back. Anyway, they have these ensuing things that happen. So from 1868, you fast forward to 1876, and that's Custer's last stand. So I think many of you are familiar with that, and Custer goes in, and within 45 minutes or something, all of his men die when they attack the Indian encampment on the river. So fast forward 3 years, and Luther Standing Bear is attending school at the Carlisle School, which was like an Indian reform school. What did you call it, Brent? The School for Hitler Youth?
It sounds like an integration system, like Hitler's Youth.
So what they were doing was they wanted to take the youth and send them to these schools to help them adapt to white society. You know, the goal of the school was really to assimilate the Indians into the white man's world. So he goes to the Carlisle School, and he learns there. Then he becomes a member. You know, years later, first he goes and he's a very skilled.
He's smart.
Yeah, he's smart. He's very skilled in he keeps books like an accountant. He works as a clerical clerk. He does odd, like standard jobs that any European white dude would be doing, any American. And he continues to grow. And then in 1902, he ends up becoming a member of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And he tours with that show for a while. And then, after that, he goes back to the reservation. He goes back and forth throughout the years. And each time he comes to the reservation, he sees it in a worse state than it was before. And then he leaves again. And then in 1933, he wrote this book. And so, Luther Standing Bear had led a full life and had a broad range of experiences by the time he wrote The Land of the Spotted Eagle, the book we're reviewing today. As an Indian author with 4 books to his credit, Luther Standing Bear deserves more recognition than he has received. His publication list is a remarkable accomplishment for an individual whose formal education was limited to a few brief years at Carlisle. That there were so few Indian authors in the 19th and early 20th centuries adds to his significance in American literary history. Reason I bring this up is just to provide context to the person that we're reading from. This isn't someone who doesn't understand or hasn't seen both sides or lived in both worlds. Naturally, Luther Standing Bear, because of his upbringing and his family, he's going to have biases toward his people. And perhaps that comes out. somewhat in the book.
But he never talks in such a manner that he says that he hates the white guys.
No.
You don't pick up on that at all.
No, but there's definitely
There's some bias.
distrust.
Yeah.
Severe distrust.
Well,
intense distrust.
he has history behind him, you know. It's
Yeah.
making him a little leery, and that's fine. But I definitely think he's the only one at this time that was capable of writing this book.
Yeah, very true. So I think it's very important for, I think it would do well for more Americans to know their own history and the history of the Native people as well. I heard Stephen Ranella a while ago. I remember, maybe it was in his book, Meat Eater.
Say which book?
But maybe it was his Buffalo book. But in one of them, he said something to the effect of all young boys that grow up, you know, in the woods and stuff, they either envision themselves as a mountain man or as an Indian. Like, there's one or two. You either we're like, yeah, I'm a mountain man, cowboys
and Indians,
or Indian. And for whatever reason, I always kind of fancied myself wanting to be an Indian, not so much the cowboy or the mountain man. And so I always was fascinated by the history of the Indians, how they saw the world, and sought out books and knowledge from those places. And it has really informed my thinking on the world. Okay. Let's start off with some of this distrust. The most famous and well-documented violation of Lakota rights was the 1874 Black Hills expedition of geologists and soldiers under George Custer, who were sent in by the federal government to explore the Black Hills and report on the extent of gold deposits. The Dakota and Lakota angrily protested the direct violation of the 1868 treaty. Although the government admitted this expedition was illegal, it justified the survey, stating it was only to gain information about mineral wealth in the Black Hills. Almost at once, geological reports of gold in the Black Hills leaked to the general public, and a stampede of miners poured into the area. By law, these gold seekers were trespassing in area defined as Lakota country in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. Half-hearted attempts by the military to keep miners out of the area were unsuccessful, and by the spring of 1875, the Black Hills were overrun by prospectors. Rather than enforce the 1868 treaty and remove intruders from the Black Hills, as the Dakota and Lakota vehemently demanded, the federal government's response was to call together a council to again change the terms of the treaty. This time the government proposed to purchase the Black Hills. Now, this was never going to happen because of all their land, that was the land that the Lakota cherished. It would be similar, tantamount to you, like, you know, giving up your most prized.
To give up your beachfront property?
Not so much. I mean, maybe so it's more relatable, just giving up something that you find the most valuable thing to you in the world. The most beautiful, most valuable, most worth. So they were not going to give it up. So they didn't meet and they wouldn't agree on things. And the miners continued to flood in and decimate the Black Hills. And then you have the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And then the Indians were shortly after that battle. When General Custer was taken down and all those men died, it created backlash for the Indians because at that point, you know, there were a lot of people who adored Custer, who idolized and worshipped him and saw him as this great general and so forth. And so, you know, when all those people, they wanted revenge. You know, the American people wanted revenge on these vicious savages. And so they sent the armies out. Tons of volunteers came, and they came out to deal retribution to the evil Indians, right? So they came out, and this is how I understand it. So then Custer, you know, after that, it's not long before the Indians are kind of forced onto the reservation. The Black Hills are taken away. And this is what Luther Standing Bear writes about this. Of all our domain, we love perhaps the Black Hills the most, The Lakota had named these hills Hisapa, or Black Hills, on account of their color. The slopes and peaks were so heavily wooded and dark pines that from a distance the mountains actually looked black. In wooded recesses were numberless springs of pure water and numerous small lakes. There were wood and game in abundance and shelter from the storms of the plains. It was the favorite winter haunt of the buffalo and the Lakota as well. According to a tribal legend, these hills were a reclining female figure from whose breast flowed life-giving forces, and to them the Lakota went as a child to its mother's arms. The various entrances to the hills were very rough and rugged, but there was one very beautiful and easy pass through which buffalo and Lakota entered the hills. This pass ran along a narrow stream bed which widened here and there, but which in places narrowed so that the tall pines at the top of the cliffs arched their boughs, almost touching as they swayed in the wind. Every fall, thousands of buffaloes and Lakotas went through this pass to spend the winter in the hills. Taiopa, it was called by the Lakotas, or Gate of the Buffalo. Today, this beautiful pass is void of trees, and to the white man, it is merely Buffalo Gap. Two lovely legends of the Lakotas would be fine subjects for sculpturing. The Black Hills as the Earth Mother and the story of the genesis of the tribe. Instead, the face of a white man is being outlined on the face of the stone cliff in the Black Hills, as he's referring to Mount Rushmore. This beautiful region, of which the Lakota thought more than any other spot on earth, caused him the most pain and misery. These hills were to become prized by the white people for reasons far different from those of the Lakota. To the Lakota, the magnificent forests and splendid herds were incomparable in value. To the white man, everything was valueless except the gold in the hills. Toward the Indian, the white people were absolutely devoid of sentiment, and when a people lack sentiment, they are without compassion. So down went the Black Forest, and to death went the last buffalo, noble animal and immemorial friend of the Lakota. As for the people, who were as native to the soil as the forests and the buffalo, well, the gold seekers did not understand them and never have. The white man will never know the horror and the utter bewilderment of the Lakota at the wanton destruction of the buffalo. What cruelty has not been glossed over with the white man's word enterprise? If the Lakotas had been relinquishing any part of their territory voluntarily, the Black Hills would have been the last from the standpoint of traditional sentiment. So, when by false treaties and trickery the Black Hills were forever lost, they were a broken people. The treaties made supposedly to recompense them for the loss of this lovely region were, like all other treaties, worthless. But could the Lakota braves have foreseen the ignominy they were destined to endure, every man would have died fighting rather than give up his homeland to live in subjection and helplessness. One of the reasons that I wanted to bring this up, and as I thought about these issues around public lands that we have today, conservation and wildlife, I think about this example where you have two people converge that have a completely different view of what value is. And one sees buffalo herds and the pristine rivers and nature and wild as this glorious and wonderful prize and blessed thing. And then you have the other culture that sees the gold in the hills as value and precious. They're completely two diametrically opposed viewpoints. And as he says, when the miners and stuff came through, they cut down the entire forest. They killed all the buffalo, wiped them out. And as I think about that as a people, and as, I'm only glossing over some parts of this book, it's comprehensive, and I encourage those that are listening to go and read it for themselves, because when he gets into the details of how the Indian families are raised, how their diet, what they eat, and how they live, it's pretty fascinating. How they create bows and arrows and how they hunt with them and all of that. It's pretty wow.
We were talking about that earlier, and the thing that really impressed upon me was the dedication and the time that was spent on each kid. It wasn't they were just making a kid, they were making a citizen, a member of their tribe, and everyone joined in together to help make that next unit in the tribe.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like I was telling you, they only have a child every 6 years.
So they can dedicate all the time and attention to funneling it into the one kid. That's what I'm saying. They're putting all this focus and effort and energy into making the next citizen of their tribe.
Right. And it was really looked down upon, like really the tribe in general. That was like the rule. You had one kid at a time, like every 6 years. You don't go and have a second one until that one reaches 6 years of age. And so there was an extreme amount of effort and time that went into raising that youth.
Each kid, yeah.
Yeah. Totally fascinating concept, right? You're not going to overpopulate the plains, that's for sure. I don't know what they use for birth control or how that worked.
I don't get that. That's impressive.
But yeah, I mean, if you had another one in that time frame, shame on you, you know. Other things too that were really interesting about, and if people want me to go into detail on that, I can. I would love to do a podcast on that. Let me know. Write in, send me a note. If I have enough people that want me to explore that subject, then I will. I want to keep this subject, this podcast on topic of how we see value and how maybe the Native people saw it, how white people have seen it, how we see it today, and contrast those two viewpoints. So in this, like I said, the white man kind of destroyed everything that the Indian saw as value. Can you imagine if all the elk and mule deer were gone? Or for you on the East Coast, or those that whitetail is your passion, can you imagine a people coming in and hunting them to extinction, and you're just watching? You're just watching them disappear until they're gone.
It wouldn't happen nowadays. You kidding me? You'd have small armies of hunter militiamen walking around saying no more.
And that's encouraging, because there certainly is a number of people who value wildlife in our country to the point where they fiercely try to protect it. And there are organizations like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and such that are trying to restore elk populations and keep those that are in existence today healthy and strong.
Well, I mean, we don't really have to imagine, Brian. We can't hunt buffalo.
Yeah. I mean, you can in some places. There's some,
but
some
not the places
hunts.
like. I mean, they used to be everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking millions of buffalo to now. There's just a few herds here and there in different states for sure. But at this time, I mean, I think the buffalo at one point got down to like 20 buffalo, 13 buffalo
Not
total
much.
that existed on the planet. I mean, we were that close.
That's insane.
To extinction.
That's that's the car partly tilting off of the cliffside. You didn't stop in time. Like, 2 more pounds in the front of the car, you're going over.
Yeah.
That's close.
Yeah, very close. But at this time, as far as he knows, as far as Luther Standing Bear knows, the buffalo is extinct. You know, and there were many animals during this time that I think our history books don't talk about enough. We don't talk about conservation in our schools, and we don't acknowledge the situation enough. But when Europeans inhabited this land, the number of animals that became extinct is astonishing.
Well, just look at it beforehand. How many animals went extinct before the white people showed up?
Very, according to Luther Standing Bear, there's a quote in here in the book where he's like, he cannot recall a time, nor can Indian history recall a time where an animal existed and then became extinct.
They were just always there, no matter what.
Yeah. So, I mean, take that for what it's worth, but given the way they lived in harmony with the planet and the way other things worked, I'm not surprised within maybe their oral tradition that there was not a single animal that had become extinct to their recollection, But I think, that's mind-blowing to think that
not only that, but if it did go extinct during their time, it wasn't on their account.
Yeah.
It was probably some kind of disease or something else.
Well, certainly they didn't hunt it to extinction.
Yes,
Correct.
That doesn't happen until the
with
Europeans
market
come
hunting
along.
and selling and exploiting of life for your own gain. It takes a certain lack of, I guess, there has to be a certain view in your mind of where wildlife ranks to to justify a way to eliminate the hunting an animal until it's gone. And I think sometimes they just assumed it was an infinite supply, or they told themselves that. But regardless, I don't want to spend too much time on that. I just want people listening to understand that from the Lakota perspective, how devastating it would be to sit there and watch this animal that you absolutely cherish be wiped out. And to sit and watch that would be rough. I know for me, the way I feel about elk and mule deer and blacktail, like the idea of them becoming extinct, being hunted to extinction by another culture that came in and didn't value it, it would be devastating.
It's hard to grasp that because in our lives, look how much has changed. You know, in the natives, it never changed. It was the same for hundreds of thousands of years. And now these people in the last 100 years have got to see change coming through their land. Oh. They don't even have a concept to share that.
Conquest and
they can't even put that point across.
And, you know, you can't talk about this without talking about how they see the value here. Because the question that, as I talked about, you know, protecting public lands and ensuring their safety, because I do believe that public lands provide habitat and protection for wild places and wild animals in a way that most private land situations would not, right? And so I'm a fierce defender of public lands for what I believe ensures the safety of the future of wild places and wild animals. And we can get into that a little bit later, simply because I just see when you take a land and you sell it to a private person, our history does not demonstrate that people set it aside or buy it for simply the use of it existing there in a natural state. We don't. We develop it. We put houses on it. We turn them into resorts. We mine them. We extract resources. We make the land useful. And in this case is a microcosm of that, this example of the Black Hills, where the white man came in and grabbed the gold and destroyed everything else. And the idea that we're past that, I think, is foolish sentiment, because we're not. We still do that all the time.
Who's going to go buy 100,000 acres and then just let it sit? What would you think of that individual? You think he's a little off?
Well, I think it's delusional to believe that that's the case. There are those that can afford to do that,
but they're still using it. What you're suggesting is that someone's going to buy this land privately, and they're just never going to touch this again. No, they're going to use it for their own purposes.
True, but it doesn't mean they wouldn't manage it for conservation purposes. I just think that's that to hang your hat on that is a foolish notion. To say, okay, we're just going to trust everyone that when we sell off these public lands to private people, that everyone out of the goodness of their heart is just going to make sure that they take care of wildlife. I just don't think I just do not believe that's not how we see nature today. Most people, and that's not how we saw it back then. Senator Mike Lee said the other day, it's a quote of him saying that these public lands are just sitting there not being used. They're just sitting there wasting. They're just sitting there not being leveraged. And again, it goes back to, well, what is value to you? Because I've heard Stephen Ranella mentioned this before. Why is it that a land has to be doing something? Why does it have to be being mined or drilled for gas or cut down? Or why does it always have to generate like a dollar amount? Why can't its value just be that it exists in its nature? You'll see that this concept is really difficult for some to see the value in it. And for some, not so much. It's apparent. It's easy to see the value in it. So he says this in the book. Luther Standing Bear says, "I have come to know that the white mind does not feel toward nature as does the Indian mind. And it is because I believe of the difference in childhood instruction. I have often noticed white boys gathered in a city by-street or alley, jostling and pushing one another in a foolish manner. They spend much time in this aimless fashion, their natural faculties neither seeing, hearing, nor feeling the varied life that surrounds them. There is about them no awareness, no acuteness, and it is this dullness that gives ugly mannerisms full play. It takes from them natural poise and stimulation. In contrast, Indian boys who are naturally reared are alert to their surroundings. Their senses are not narrowed to observing only one another, and they cannot spend hours seeing nothing and hanging out and thinking nothing in particular. Observation was certain in its rewards. Interest, wonder, admiration grew, and the fact was appreciated that life was more than mere human manifestation, that it was expressed in a multitude of forms. This appreciation enriched Lakota existence. Life was vivid and pulsing. Nothing was casual and commonplace. The Indian lived in every sense of the word, from his first to his last breath. And I think a lot of hunters that spend a lot of time, or backpackers, backcountry fishermen and so forth, I think people who spend a lot of time in nature can relate to this. It's like when I go to, LA or a big city and I walk in and I'm really enveloped in the city life, and it's exciting and it's cool. And there's these great restaurants and these different Broadway plays to take in and all of this culture and civilization. And it has its place. But I find myself, often looking around and realizing that there's no nature around me. I kind of understand what he means when he says that he's basically just saying that people are disconnected from nature that don't live in it, that never experience it, that aren't reared in the same way as the Indian is, where he's out in the wild from the moment he's born.
Do you remember we went to Prince of Wales?
Yeah.
And we grew up out in the rainforest ourselves. And so going to Prince of Wales was very similar to going back home to Oregon. But the people that we were with were from Arizona and stuff.
Yeah.
They were like so excited to see these trees and whatnot. And they were like it was so foreign to them. And it honestly felt like a homecoming. It did not feel very different from stepping out my old back porch.
Well, we, for some context, Brent and I grew up on lots of acreage in a coastal forest in Oregon, somewhat inland, but still coastal part of Oregon. And, from like childhood, we were thrown out the door. Me more than you, because you had the day of Nintendo and video games, and you also had leukemia, and so you were bedridden.
I was a little more shut in until, I was 12-ish or so, yeah.
Diagnosed with chemo when you were 5 or 6. 5.
2 weeks before I turned 7.
Yeah. Okay. So different than me a little bit in that regard. I mean, when I was a kid, we lived in a tent for almost a year on the property. Mom and Dad couldn't afford to build a house or anything, so they were like, wall tent, boom. And it wasn't really a legit wall tent. It was more like a Coleman dumpy wall tent. There's no fireplace in it or anything. But we lived in that, and kind of while we cut roads and put in power and septic and prepared to build the house and all that. And I can remember I was little. I was young, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we just kind of were outside. And our parents loved kicking us out the door, and it didn't matter if it was pouring rain or if it was sunny. It was like, go outside.
They're cutthroat. We're done with you. Be gone.
Yeah. And my parents were young. I mean, I was born, they were 16, 17 years old. So, mid-20s, they're like, yeah, I don't want to deal with you. Go outside. I have a life of my own here.
Yeah, no, you were 19. No, you were 15 when I was born.
Yeah.
15 it's a big difference.
So, anyway, I did grow up outdoors all the time from a youth. And, I think it did create an awareness in me that someone who maybe lived in a big city doesn't have. That connection's not there.
There are definitely some people that I have that are good friends, good people, but they have no concept of hanging out in the woods of any kind. They're concrete babies.
So he goes on. This leads into another thing that he wrote. The Indian and the white man sense things differently because the white man has put distance between himself and nature, and assuming a lofty place in the scheme of order of things, has lost for him both reverence and understanding. Consequently, the white man finds Indian philosophy obscure, wrapped, as he says, in a maze of ideas and symbols which he does not understand. Many times the Indian is embarrassed and baffled by the white man's allusions to nature in such terms as crude, primitive, wild, rude, untamed, and savage. For the Lakota, mountains, lakes, rivers, springs, valleys, and woods were all finished beauty. Winds, rain, snow, shine, day, night, and change of seasons brought interest. Birds, insects, and animals filled the world with knowledge that defied the discernment of man. But nothing the great mystery placed in the land of the Indian pleased the white man, and nothing escaped his transforming hand. Wherever forests have not been mowed down, wherever the animal is recessed in their quiet protection, wherever the earth is not bereft of four-footed life, that to him is an unbroken wilderness. But since for the Lakota there was no wilderness, since nature was not dangerous but hospitable, not forbidding but friendly, Lakota philosophy was healthy, free from fear and dogmatism. And I here find the great distinction between the faith of the Indian and the white man. Indian faith sought the harmony of man with his surroundings. The other sought the dominance of surroundings. In sharing, in loving all and everything, one people naturally found a measure of the thing they sought, while in fearing, the other found need of conquest. When he says the white man senses things differently, because the white man has put distance between himself and nature, I think there's so much truth to that. And my response is, man is part of nature. Like, we're in it. We're an animal too. Like, we are of the earth and the soil and the air, just like all the other animals are. And the idea that we are separate from it, like we get cities and we get this other stuff, and now we're not part of nature, I think is a destructive thought. And in the process of becoming, apart from nature, I think we do not feel compelled, the compassion toward nature that we should, because we don't rely on it like we should. We take it for granted.
I think that has something to do with some, your own taking responsibility. Because, when you go out there and you hunt something, we don't take a responsibility towards life. Life takes life. Like, nothing in this planet gets to live without something else dying.
Yeah.
It never happens. But the farther that we separate ourselves from it, the easier that seems to do for people.
Yeah, the easier it is for them to ignore the fact that that's the case.
Because no one wants to take the responsibility for the cow that they're eating. It's not a cow, Brian. It's steak.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Right. Well, he says, but the old Lakota was wise. He knew that man's heart away from nature becomes hard. He knew that lack of respect for growing, living things soon led to a lack of respect for humans too. So he kept his youth close to its softening influence. And I think that's interesting that he's saying that nature is a softening influence. I think nature's hard, for sure. But I think what he's saying is when you are out in nature and you depend on it and you live on it and you consume it, and you recognize clean water, clean air, and the beauty of the landscape, when you take it all in like that, you value it so differently than someone who lives in a building that gets food at the grocery store and doesn't strive outdoors. It's so easy to just take it all for granted and not really understand the cycle of life, to understand where things come from, that life eats life, and all of these kind of things. He says, I know of no species of plant, bird, or animal that were exterminated until the coming of the white man. For some years after the buffalo disappeared, there still remained huge herds of antelope, but the hunter's work was no sooner done in the destruction of the buffalo than his attention was attracted toward the deer. They are plentiful now only where protected. The white man considered natural animal life, just as he did the natural man life upon this continent, as pests. Plants which the Indian found beneficial were also pests. There is no word in the Lakota vocabulary with the English meaning of this word. So they don't go, man, that animal sucks. Let's just kill that one.
I think
let's
crazy.
wipe that one out. Like, let's kill all the wolves.
No concept for the word pest. That blows my, I don't know what else you call a mouse, but a pest.
Yeah.
I can't stand when mice get in my stuff.
No, and he talks about how the Indian views things like mice and these other animals, and they actually took quite a bit of joy in all of them and saw them as animals, as things that needed respect. And had their place.
Yeah, no, white people definitely have a hierarchy of things. Spiders, mice, anything that creeps and crawls too much, it's at the bottom. It can always die.
Right, for sure. There's he says this right here. The animal had rights, the rights of man's protection, the right to live, the right to multiply, the right to freedom, and the right to man's indebtedness. And in recognition of these rights, the Lakota never enslaved the animal and spared all life that was not needed for food and clothing. This concept of life and its relations was humanizing and gave to the Lakota an abiding love. It filled his being with the joy and mystery of living. It gave him reverence for all life. It made a place for all things in the scheme of existence with equal importance to all. The Lakota could despise no creature, for all were of one blood, made by the same hand and filled with the essence of the great mystery. In spirit, the Lakota was humble and meek. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, was true for the Lakota. And from the earth he inherited secrets long since forgotten. His religion was sane, normal, and human. And so they saw animals a little differently than we do. And even today, the way we see them. But I think we are seeing more and more in our world, in our culture, a broad love of wildlife and concern for it, which is very encouraging. He talks about their beliefs, somewhat their belief in in spiritual things, and he says, from the earth sprang the Lakota nation and the Lakota man, and so far as we know, our people have been born and have died on this plain, and no people have shared it with us until the coming of the European. Right, I think basically they have an oral tradition that's carried down, not a lot of written stuff, but suffice it to say, they've been on the plains a long time. And so this land of Great Plains is claimed by the Lakotas as their very own. We are of the soil, and the soil is of us. We love the birds and beasts that grew with us on the soil. They drank the same water we did and breathed the same air. We are all one in nature, believing so. There was in our hearts a great peace and a welling kindness for all living, growing things. I don't think you could say among European and the white culture that came across that they had this belief and that all animals were equal and that all people were equal, that they were one in nature. It just wasn't the case. And they said, because, believing so, there was in our hearts a great peace and a welling kindness for all living, growing things. Our actions demonstrated that we were not like that. No. What Theodore Roosevelt did was save countless species from extinction when he set aside public lands and national refuges. And the millenary trade was going on at the time of his presidency, where they were just shooting wholesale songbirds, any bird with color and plumage, and they were selling these feathers at this massive rate to the fashion industry across Europe and the U.S. And they were just eliminating and causing the extinction of various species of bird. And in the midst of this, Theodore Roosevelt steps out and says, you know what, we're going to stop this, right? And others joined in, and even the Queen of England came out and said, it's disgusting to use feathers and at the expense of the beauty of these wild animals. And I think it goes to show the callousness of what people thought of wild animals at the time in this culture. I think that I would like to say that a whole bunch of Europeans and early Americans loved wildlife. The evidence doesn't point to that.
No, not so much.
The evidence more or less pointed to let's mow down the the Americas and make it like England. Let's put streets in. Let's kill all the animals. Let's bring in our livestock and our domesticated stuff. Get rid of the wild pests. And they didn't see animals as having rights or value. And then the way that they abused animals, the way that they abused mules, horses, and dogs and so forth, even animals for farming. I was reading a book that I'll talk about in another podcast called The Wilderness Warrior about Theodore Roosevelt. And there's a lot of historical information there. And they were talking about sea turtles that they were getting from, I'm not sure where, Florida, I think.
It's a good place.
And they're capturing these sea turtles. And then what they would do is they would like screw their fins to the wood deck so they couldn't escape. And they just stacked them on these wood boards, one after the other, alive, screwed to these boards, and they'd bring them in and then sell them for soup and for eating and different things up in the eastern cities. And like, people didn't look at animals suffering or that as a travesty in any way.
That's pretty horrific.
And that's just one example. There's thousands upon thousands of these things that were occurring in the treatment of animals. And I think that that's why it's not really a surprise that the Indians were baffled by the way the white man saw wildlife. So going back to the book, he says, one lesson to learn was to be strong in will. Little children were taught to give and to give generously. A sparing giver was no giver at all. Possessions were given away until the giver was poor in this world's goods and had nothing left but the delight and joy of pure strength. It was a bounden duty to give to the needy and helpless. When mothers gave food to the weak and old, they gave portions to their children at the same time, so that the children could perform the service of giving with their own hands. So the Lakota was taught to give at any and all times for the sake of becoming brave and strong. The greatest brave was he who could part with his most cherished belongings and at the same time sing songs of joy and praise. It was accustomed to hold giveaway dances and to distribute presents that were costly and rare. To give is the delight of the Lakota.
The first time you read that to me, it made me think of, growing up, we had something kind of similar, but the complete opposite to that. We called it white elephant.
Yeah, giveaway dances and to distribute presents that were costly and rare. To give is the delight of the Lakota. This is crazy. The greatest brave was one who could part with his most cherished belongings and at the same time sing joys of praise. Lakota was taught to give at any time and all times for the sake of becoming brave and strong. Think about that they're encouraged as a society, as a culture, to give away everything because that makes you better and stronger. It makes you brave. It makes you brave.
It's very much stoicism.
Yeah, I thought of the word stoicism too when I first heard it. Living minimalist style of life, basically.
There's definitely a strength of going without.
Right. It was not Indian custom for individuals to lay up stores for revenue, to fence land, to capture and hold animals for sale, to fight kith and kin, or to lay by any goods for the sake of mere possession. So, I can tell from reading that there's, even in me, I'm all about ownership and private property, and this is mine and not yours. And I feel like that's a very American viewpoint. At the same time, I see the Indian, he explains further that this is not socialism. It's not like, okay, we're going to redistribute wealth here. This was libertarianism. It was let each man choose how he will live. But as a society, they highly encouraged giving up all your possessions because it made you stronger. Now think about that. If you gave up everything you had, what does that do? Where does that leave you? What do you see as still having if you've given away all your earthly goods, all your physical possessions? What do you have left? What are you left with in your mind?
You're left with kin, your own body, and your abilities, I suppose. There's not a whole lot you're left with than what you yourself inherently have.
I think, it's sort of that old cliche, like you should focus on the things that you can take with you when you die. Mm-hmm. Or you can't take this with you when you die. There's a lot of truth in that, I believe. I've said this before on the podcast multiple times. I'm not really motivated by money. I mean, I need enough to do some things. But my motivation has never been wealth or money, and it's driven my employers crazy. You know, hey, we'll pay you 2 times your salary if you'll do this, this. And I'm like, yeah, no, this is good.
It's like that Mexican Fisher story we were talking about earlier.
That Tim Ferriss in the 4-Hour Work Week.
Yep.
What is he like? He's got a little boat.
A lawyer goes down to Mexico, meets this fisherman guy who's coming in, and he's asking him, hey, is that your boat? And they start talking about boats, and he's like, and then the lawyer guy starts giving him advice. You know, if you were just to work a few more hours every day, you could bring in X amount of money.
Get a second
boat. And then in just a few months, you could have a fleet. And then with that fleet, you'd be able to start up an LLC or some kind of a business. And then the guy's like, well, then what would I do? Well, then you would come home, fish a little, have a siesta, hang out with your family, and pretty much live the life that you're already living right now.
Right. It was like this epiphany where the lawyer realized that what he was saying was make all this money, engage in enterprise, become wealthy and rich, and do all these things so that you can have this lifestyle that the dude already had, which was simple, live out his days on the water, fishing,
carefree with his family and his
family,
friends.
and doing, and that's when, I mean, that always resonated with me. I have come to the conclusion in my life that things and possessions and wealth, earthly wealth, does not bring me any measure of happiness. If I'm not happy with where I'm at right now in terms of my financials, my wealth, I won't be happy with more, because happiness isn't contingent on wealth. Of course, you need enough that you have food, shelter,
X amount of money,
and you can live.
Everyone has an X amount of money, and that X might be a little bit different for every person, but it's a lot less than most people think.
Well, they talk about it in these studies where they measure joy or happiness in people, and they've realized, they've come to these conclusions where once human beings have enough money to feel safe, food, water, shelter,
yep,
and they have that, any income beyond that, incremental income beyond that, doesn't increase their level of happiness. Happiness is derived from so many other things, or joy. And I think back to this, when I first read this when I was 20, 21, I remember reading him talking about how giving away everything, earthly possession that they had, made them stronger. I will say that giving away everything you had like that certainly made me think about, could I do it? And if I lived a minimalist life, would I attain happiness? Would I have happiness? And I realized that the answer was yes. And from that time forward, I've lived a very minimalist life. You know, we lived in a treehouse for like 10 years. It's just a small, little, modest house.
You say treehouse, but it was basically a box that you suspended up in the trees.
Dude, it was Swiss Family Robertson legit.
I'm not saying it wasn't legit, but I am saying it was tiny.
Yes, it was small.
Little bitty.
Well, I lived in Japan as a missionary for a couple of years in a room about as big as this, studio. Your bed you take out of a closet, lay on the floor, get in it, and then you put it back in the closet so you have room to like do other things in the space. I mean, it's just a one room deal. I mean, and I was happy. My point is that possessions aren't really what increase or give me happiness. Aaron and I both have practiced Snyder. Aaron was from the first time I began following Aaron Snyder on, first on Bow Site and other posts that were on forums on the internet, and then later as he went to Rockslide and in other places, I observed that Aaron didn't own a fancy house. He rented an apartment, usually some kind of condo or apartment place, and then he drove a pretty modest car and junky to some level. But he did what he loved, and he spent almost every week and weekend in the mountains, taking in nature and exploring and carrying his backpack and going places and traveling to different places, Northwest Territories and so on, and experiencing things that he wanted to experience, not accumulating wealth, but rather giving it all away or exchanging it for other things of value to him. So I think you can't really talk about how the Native American viewed wildlife and versus European or white people did without looking at how they handled wealth. And the Indian thinking that they were more wealthy when they gave away everything. When I hear something like Senator Mike Lee come out and talk about public lands and how they're wasting away and not being used, I'm wondering, like, what if it depends on how you value the world and how you see nature and how you see wealth. If you see these places if you see them as revenue generating machines that allow you to build what you see as bigger buildings, more extravagant, more comfortable lifestyle, then I think you can't recognize the land and value it for what it really is in terms of just being nature. Does it make sense? Or am I like being all like...
No, I definitely see that. It's hard for them to have a value on it, the way that it's just sitting there to them.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not doing something, if they're not going and they're not conquering it, it's wasted to them.
Yeah. Well, the book is, I've only scratched the surface. I mean, the coolest stuff is how they make bows and how they train to be warriors and how they ride horses and the things that they're able to do. He talks about riding a horse before he could like really walk. His parents like actually tie him to the horse so he doesn't fall off because he doesn't have the muscles to stay on. I mean, that's a connection to animals at such a young age. It's a whole different level of understanding and communication and interaction with animals. I love the part about eating meat, which I shared with Brent earlier, where he talks about vegetarians, and he's like...
Well, he meets a woman who says she's a vegetarian, and she's doing it for spiritual purposes.
Yeah. And he's like, I'm sorry, but... he talks about how there's no jails, no prisons, no poorhouses, none of this stuff in their culture. Doesn't exist. But when he goes into the cities and he's around the Europeans and white people, there's people in jail, there's people that have drug problems, there's all these things that are just completely foreign to their way of life. The chapters on health and how they deal with health and how they eat, I think just from the Gritty podcast standpoint and listeners being interested in health and wellness, it is an interesting subject to dive into.
It still plays into the same theme because their motto of health went along with the whole strength of going without.
Yeah.
The wearing less clothing type thing so that they'd be hardier and stronger. That's still just a perpetuation.
It's very Wim Hof-y, the way they talk about
Wim Hof-y.
Breathing in the morning air when it's super cold, being in ice baths and plunges, walking around in just a breech clout and nothing else and bare skin in freezing cold weather. These kind of things are so foreign to our way of living.
Do you remember, I don't remember what book it was, but we were talking, when I first was looking back on Wim Hof a couple years ago, there was this Native American lady who gave birth, and there was a white woman who gave birth to a kid in the same place.
Yes.
And then the Native American went outside, like just dropped this baby, goes outside, scoops up snow, and washes the afterbirth off the baby with snow. Mm-hmm. That's nuts.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all.
Right.
And the European lady keeps her baby warm and soft and covered up and blah, blah, blah. And the European lady's baby ended up dying, and the other one who, the moment it was born, was shoved face first into snow, survived.
Yeah, no,
it seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think, was that The Journey of Crazy Horse, or I can't remember which book. No, it was, I think Blood and Thunder. Anyway, they were contrasting how, they're, health-wise, they did a lot of things that they thought were better for you, keeping her warm inside this room. She had like 5 people help her give birth to the baby. They swaddled it in all these rags and clothes, kept it warm, kept the mom, and the whole time they're just sickly and weak and struggling. And the Indian woman who was there at the fort, she just walks outside by herself, gives birth next to an icy cold river, washes the baby, wraps it up on a cradle board, puts it on her back, and walks back in and goes back to work. And again, like the baby's born in the freezing cold, is washed in the ice cold river in the snow, and the baby's just fine. Now, of course, they were adapted to that. They're living in the land like they did, they were hardy. I'm sure you didn't survive through evolution. Natural selection took its course. So a sickly baby wouldn't have survived and passed its genes on to another one. So I'm sure there was that element to it, but also it was, I think, their immune systems and the strength of their body just being very high because of the hardy life that they lived.
Well, they stressed it.
Yeah, they stressed it.
Anytime you stress your body out in moderation, it becomes stronger.
Yeah.
No matter what you're trying to do.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, that whole section is chapters and chapters of it. I have notes, and I'd be happy to go over it. I just don't know the audience really wants me
People
to.
you want him to go over. It's awesome stuff.
They get in here, and he talks about, this is just one section I'm going to read for you because Brent really likes it.
Is the where the guy gets in like
Injured legs and limbs were never taken off, and recuperative powers of the body were marvelous. Little Moon came home from a war party so badly shot in the left leg that the limb swung loose from his body as he rode into the village on his horse. He jumped to the ground and hopped into his teepee without assistance. His leg from the knee down was almost separated from the upper part of the limb, but the portions were placed together and strapped to a piece of rawhide. No special attention was given him, and in a short time he was hobbling about, and he continued to mend until completely covered. While a little crippled, he was otherwise as good as ever.
They just don't make people like that anymore, bro.
I mean, totally different, right? Like, compared to amputation and...
It says they didn't even have a concept of amputation.
No.
You don't cut things off.
No. I'm sure things got cut off.
Yeah,
But yeah, he said teeth strong and white were a natural possession, many old people having the perfect teeth of youth until they died. So
it's the sugar, bro, I'm telling you. You could have lizard-like rehabilitation powers if you didn't drink soda.
Yeah, totally different, totally just a different world, right? So that's just a couple of excerpts there. They were connected to the land, though, and that connection to nature, I think, gave them appreciation for nature that the European lost at some point. And the reason I wanted to bring it up was simply because I wanted people to challenge people's ideas on what they saw as value. And the notion that we should all have this land before us and that we should obtain it as private land and then improve it. That is a common statement I've received from people emailing me about public lands, and I'm often left wondering, like, what do you mean by improve it? Like, does Bill put a house on it, mine it, log it? Like, what are you talking about when you say taking the land and improving it?
When I think of that, I think of water parks. I think that might be an improvement.
And to that, I'm like, well, why would that improve it? What's wrong with it being just what it is? Nature. For you to go out and consume, be part of. I think that we're lost in some sense as humans when we think of land in terms of how we can develop it or utilize it only, instead of thinking of it in terms of it just being pristine and left. So I think in summary here, you have these drastically, diametrically opposed cultures, right? You have the Indian who's like, I'm going to give away everything that I have. I'm going to live this minimalist lifestyle, and I see value in nature, all forms of nature and all animals, and they all have rights and should be protected. It's almost like this hippie worldview of, let's all peace and love, And then you have this other that's like, let's industrialize everything and let's be enterprising. Let's build banks and institutions and schools of higher thought and learning and all of this stuff, right? And you have this industrial era of a person who wants to come across and do mass agriculture and farming and sell and build a business. And I'm also that guy, right? Mm-hmm. So you have these two completely different cultures, and it's no wonder they didn't understand
mesh.
each other. right? And everything the Indian saw as value, the white man didn't, and everything the white man saw as value, the Indian just didn't understand. And you try to put an Indian on a reservation, and he's like, you want me to just sit here and farm and raise cattle and build houses and develop like resorts? And he's just like,
You have to find common ground, period, in any situation, any relationship to build it. They couldn't find any common ground.
No, and I'm not saying that one is inherently evil and when one is good either, because it might come across that way. Mm-hmm. But, I'm all about enterprise and building a business and growing, and I love technology and inventions, and these video cameras I have right here in front of me running in the high tech, my smartphone. And
you're definitely one of the most industrious people I know. But you've bred umpteen amount of animals. You've roofed. You've done everything under the sun.
I like learning and trying new things, but I also have the other side of me that tries to balance that with leaving nature the way it is, respecting nature, conscientiously getting my meat in a way that I feel is good for the environment and good for the future, ensuring that animals have a place of their own to thrive and survive in. And so I think when we talk about these two differences, what I want people to understand is that not one is better than the other, but that if we don't marry these two things together, we're gonna be in trouble. And that's a hard thing to do because the concepts are so different. In the foreword of this book, Standing Bear writes this: "It is the loss of Indian faith that has left a void in Indian life, a void that civilization cannot fill. The old life was attuned to nature's rhythm, bound in mystical ties to the sun, moon, and stars, to the waving grasses, flowing streams, and whispering winds. It is not a question, as so many white writers like to state it, of the white man bringing the Indian up to his plane of thought in action. It is rather a case where the white man had better grasp some of the Indian's spiritual strength. I protest against calling my people savages. How can the Indian, sharing all the virtues of the white man, be justly called a savage? The white race today is but half civilized and unable to order his life into ways of peace and righteousness." This is 1931. And so, right now it's just shortly after President Theodore Roosevelt is doing things to save entire species of animals, along with Gifford Pinchot and other great conservationists. And many of our animals are at the brink of extinction. Things are not good, right? It's hard to believe when you look at the way things are now for a lot of our animals, big game species, that they were on the brink like they were, because they're doing so well in so many locales now. I like what he says when he says, and this ties into our point, it's not a question, as so many writers like to state it, of the white man bringing the Indian up to his plane of thought and action. It is rather a case where the white man had better grasp some of the Indian's spiritual strength. We interrupt this podcast to tell you that we've broken it into two parts. As I went back and I started to edit this podcast, I realized right about this point in the show, about an hour in, we hadn't got really into the subject of public lands and how they're being managed, whether they should be transferred over to state control. And that's something I cover in part 2. We'll upload that in a day or two. This book made a huge impression on me the first time I read it. And I hope that after you heard this podcast, that it's got you thinking as well about how you see the world and how you value wilderness and the outdoors, nature that's just being nature. And I'm not hating on civilization by any means. I love civilization. What I hope comes as a result of where we're at today is that we can marry these two up better than we have. I'm headed up to Snowbird for the Total Archery Challenge, and Saturday night, the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, this Saturday night, July 14th, has their after party. Starts at 5:30. You do not have to have tickets to TAC, to the Total Archery Challenge, to attend the after party, but you do need to get some tickets if you want to come to the BHA after party. You can get them there. We're hoping as many people will show up as can to support backcountry hunters and anglers and all they do for public lands. And besides, you can win some cool stuff. So hope I see you there. It's Saturday, July 14th at 5:30 to 8:30. And it's always a good time at Snowbird, Utah. All right. Thanks, folks. Stay gritty. Despite our ever-changing, ever-indignant world with its growing ignorance of and indifference to the ways of the wild, I remain a predator, pitying those who revel in artificiality and synthetic success while regarding me and my kind as relics of a time and place no longer valued or understood. I stalk a real world of dark wood and tall grass stirred by a restless wind blowing across sunlit water and beneath star-strewn sky. And on those occasions when I choose to kill, to claim some small part of nature's bounty for my own, I do so by choice, quickly, with the learned efficiency of a skilled hunter. Further, in my heart and mind, I know the truth and make no apologies for my actions or my place in time. Others around me may opt to eat only plants, nuts, and fruits. Still others may employ faceless strangers to procure their meats, their leather, their feathers, and all those niceties and necessities of life. Such is their right, of course, and I wish them well. All I ask in return is no one begrudge me, and all of us who may answer the primordial stirrings within our hunter souls, my right to do some of these things myself. What you just heard is a quote from M.R. James. We truly live in a world that is largely ignorant and indifferent to the ways of the wild. And although some regard us as relics of a time and place no longer valued or understood, we have the opportunity to change the way these people view the hunter and the hunt. We can share our experiences and nature's bounty with those who employ these faceless strangers. And by so doing, we make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for the wild animals in the wild places we care so deeply about. Never stop sharing your passion for hunting and the outdoors. Our wild animals and our wild places depend on it.
This is Ty Stubblefield, and you're listening to the Gritty Broman.
Gritty Broman.